Welcome to our webinar today. We're just going to give it a couple of minutes to let everybody sort of join that's gonna join us today. I'll be back in about a minute. All right. Well, good morning for those of you in the West Coast, and thank you for making some time today to join us for our final webinar of the year as part of our Charging Ahead webinar. Today, we'll be talking about natural gas decarbonization strategies and impacts, and some of the international best practices we've researched, and some of the key findings that we've discovered along the way in doing this work on behalf of our clients. But first, let's start with some housekeeping. So today, we're going to first cover the United States CO2 pathways as they currently stand. We're going to look at the main natural gas decarbonization pathway options. Then we'll summarize some of the international best practices we think are worth knowing. And then we'll turn to how we see optimization of natural gas decarbonization working out best, at least with the information we currently have. And then we'll finish with takeaways and recommendations with a sneak peek into our next power session next year. Now, just to note that this webinar is being recorded and will be distributed to all registrants along with the presentation after the session. You are welcome to add any of your questions to the chat along the way. My colleague Sarah will be monitoring and managing that queue for the QA session at the end. Please also note that there is a poll that will ask what you would like to see as part of the 2025 webinar series, and look forward to seeing what the results tell us. So, without further ado, well, I'm Ezra Beeman. I'm managing director of Energeia, and we have offices in California and in Sydney. But enough about me. All right, so let's talk about the United States CO2 pathways. So the U.S. has rejoined the Paris Agreement, and as part of that, it did some analysis as to what it could hit by 2030. You see here, we are aiming for 50 to 52% 2005 levels by 2030. This target is supposed to be updated every 5 years, and it's supposed to be increased or uh, most likely increased as a function of how cost effective it is to actually achieve the targets. And as the costs fall due to technology innovation, we would expect those targets to ratchet up over time. Now, some of the U.S. states have committed to much more significant or higher CO2 reduction targets over the period. Um, but for now, we're focusing on the U.S. Overall target. So here's some work that was completed in 2023 by the EIA, or at least reported by the EIA, and it shows what the business as usual outlook looks like. You can see here it's broken out by sector as well as by fuel. And I think the key thing to focus on here is that natural gas is the second largest source of emissions in the U.S., just after oil and its derivative products. So, essential for us achieving our Paris Accord agreements and just generally for reducing our greenhouse gas emissions into the environment is decarbonization of the natural gas sector. So we've been doing research recently for one of our clients, looking across different pathways as to how this might be achieved. And there are really two primary and a third emerging pathway that we've identified. And it's summarized here. When you download this deck online, you'll see that there's actually a lot more material that stands behind this. I just don't have time to present it today. But at a high level, one pathway is to move to decarbonized fuels in the natural gas pipeline system or a parallel system, and that's the renewable natural gas or hydrogen blending pathway. Hydrogen, the studies at the moment say can be blended up to about 20%, and after that point, it becomes untenable, or you have to also switch out into appliances. There's a lot of challenges in doing that, and in many studies we've seen, folks are looking at just parallel pipeline pathways for hydrogen to actually deliver hydrogen to end consumers. RNG also looks interesting. It's lower cost at the moment, but there's a finite supply. So some of the strategies we've seen here focus on RNG in the near term because it doesn't impact the pipeline at all. It's just a little bit higher cost. And in the medium to longer term, a transition to green hydrogen, as and when we expect hydrogen costs to fall. Um, I'll jump down to then thermal energy networks. Now, this is an emerging area where a gas utility or a third party might actually choose to run a thermal energy network. So those pipelines would be carrying heating or cooling loops, and it would be installed in the rights of way that may be currently occupied by the natural gas system. It offers very low cost energy delivery due to the use of heat pumps and other technologies, and is probably best suited to colder climates. The key challenge here is that the technology is still emerging. We've seen it deployed at the campus level. It is yet to be deployed, I think, in a sort of utility scale, and you basically have to recapitalize or introduce a new utility system in order to see this deployed. But there are a lot about it that suggest it should be actively investigated where there's a lot of heating load in particular. And then there's the electrification pathway where for most natural gas end use applications, whether it's heating water or heating air, that can be electrified at increasingly cost effective rates. There are some applications of gas that can't be electrified, at least not directly because it's a feedstock. But certainly, the majority, particularly where it's dominated by commercial and residential buildings, could be electrified. And then finally, there's the hybrid approach, where a combination or portfolio of these approaches are employed to map the transition over time, maybe RNG early on, moving to either thermal energy networks or end use electrification over time as being a least cost pathway. So let's turn to some of the international best practices we've seen. Largely it focused on if you are going to move away from the existing natural gas pipeline system, either due to moving entirely to hydrogen or thermal energy networks, et cetera, how do you best deal with that in terms of targeting, prioritization, and piloting? Then also looking at the key consumer barriers to doing so, and finally, a little bit on tariff design and cost allocation, which are pretty important. So this is drawn largely from the GridWorks reports in 22 and 23, and California is a leader in looking at how they can optimally decarbonize their gas system. On the top left, there are some pictures about different gas topologies and distribution networks. Now, when we were doing a decommissioning study in Australia, we identified that not all gas topologies are the same. In the same way that electricity might have radial and mesh, you sort of have the same issue in gas networks, and so it's really important to be uh, to understand what sort of topology you have, because if the network is highly meshed, then there's not a lot of spurs that you can sort of prune away, which is one of the focus areas in California. Then, when it comes to targeting criteria, I think what we have to the left here is an ideal targeting criteria when you have access and the utility is in partnership with trying to identify the least cost option. When you don't have access to utility data, then you lose sight of things like hydraulic feasibility, which are fundamental to ensuring that you're picking out that first of all you're segmenting the system in the right way, and that you are identifying a least cost way of decommissioning that system. Without that, you really are looking more at the economic factors, which are shown here as benefit cost criteria, excluding maybe gas pipeline costs, but really just the unit costs to consumers, and also their equipment change out costs. And then finally, on the bottom right, in California, they're actually actively looking at places to pilot this decommissioning approach. I know in Australia, for example, we've got communities that are putting up their hand and joining together to be an early adopter of a full electrification, or at least a natural gas phase out. Now, turning to consumer barriers, we did some. We engaged with a wide range of building electrification program managers, and we asked them what they thought the biggest barriers were. So this was asking those folks that are trying to deploy this technology what they saw as being of most concern. We backed this up with some desktop research of any surveys that were out here as well. But what you see here is a very clear standout concern around high upfront cost to consumer. So if you're changing out, a gas furnace for a electric heat pump, it can be significantly higher cost, and that is seen by consumers and by program managers as the number one concern, more than double the times it was mentioned over even reliability. So what we've done here is we've listed all those concerns that we recorded and their frequency, and then we identified, well, how could we best address this barrier on the right hand side? And so you can see that education is a key strategy for dealing with a wide range of potential barriers for consumer adoption of building electrification technologies. But at the very top is the financial incentive, and so we're going to go into that in a second. Um, Other potential solutions are making it easy, concierge, streamlining, that sort of thing, financing, and then finally, it's focused on workforce development, and that's a topic we think we keep seeing in our work, and we think is so important that it's probably going to be a future topic all on its own. So one of the things that electrification and just generally gas decarbonization is able to leverage at the moment is the IRA credits and incentives that are being worked through at the state level and then ultimately to local programs. And what we did is we broke out the amount of incentive that you could access, at least as a program manager. We broke it out by space heating, water heating, and cooking as the three sort of residential focus areas here. And then we broke it up by low income, middle income, and high income. And you can see that, and it's not 100, one for one. Some of these incentives are on whole of house basis, et cetera. But we've done our best here to provide our own independent view of what this looks like. And what you can see is the residual net incentive that programs would have to address in order to remove this barrier. Um, and so that's one of the things that we encourage our customers to do is to net of these other incentives. How do we fix the rest of it? So particularly so the disadvantaged are not impacted by the transition. And the disadvantage, they can be different definitions of income relative to the median, but there are also folks that are renting that don't really have a choice or may not be able to upgrade. And so this really speaks to the property owner making a no-brainer investment to improve the amenity for its renters and to be more competitive. The other thing on the bottom left that we're showing is that there's a distribution of costs. And I think this comes from the tech database actually in California, and it shows that there's a wide range of costs. So even if you've got if you have a certain average incentive rate, it's important to be mindful that there's a distribution of costs. And I think really key to program success is figuring out how you can ensure folks are not over or underpaid, and that this finite resource of incentive is fairly allocated. But increasingly, it looks like most of these upfront barriers can be addressed through effective programs. So the final best practice thing that we wanted to raise to people's attention is it's hard to get people to move to an electric solution if the actual cost per kilowatt hour is higher than what they'd pay in gas. And so one of the solutions that the state of California has taken via the CPUC process is to actually move more of the cost recovery into the fixed part of the rate design and to lower the variable rate design. And so you see here, I think this is PG. It says so that they have a time of use price, and then they have a BE rate or building electrification rate, which is ever so slightly less expensive because they're moving more of that fixed cost to a monthly charge. Now, whether or not this is the optimal setting, I think is certainly subject of much debate. There's certainly political pressures that are being brought to bear here as to what the level of fixed cost is, because it tends to impact those that use less more than those that use more. Now, finally, on the bottom left, we have the how do you actually allocate the cost of any decommissioning, including write downs and the cost of maybe digging up the assets if that's the policy. So here we have a range of options. This comes from a UK paper where the government's paying, which ultimately means taxpayers, the network gas investors, future consumers, current consumers, and then potentially the purchasers of the networks for repurposing. Could be the right-of-ways, could be the TENS network, etc. Um, and at the moment, there is no real clear cost allocation, I guess, silver bullet. But I think you'll see in the work that we've done that it starts to maybe provide some information that could be considered in the decision around cost allocation. So let's turn to what we see as how you best optimize gas sector decarbonization, mostly focused on the decommissioning side. So first of all, you're going to bring together a cost benefit assessment. You can't make a decision, an economic decision, without it. And what we found in our work was that not all of these costs and benefits were easily able to be accessed. There is some information that's only held by the utility. So unless you have access to that, and not all regulators or policymakers do, you will struggle to put together an accurate cost benefit assessment. And then in some cases, for example, appliance replacement costs, um, uh, or even government electrification incentive programs. It's not available at the utility or in the public domain. It's held by government, for example, or just doesn't exist. Um, so one of the first things, particularly for the policymakers and regulators, but also utilities that want to encourage stakeholder engagement and support for programs, is to make sure that we have this data and it's reasonably accessible. Now, one of the hardest things to access and may not ever be made publicly available is the hydraulic modeling data. But without it, you can look to future programs. You could avoid the cost. You can look to customer unit prices, but really making decisions about this portion over that portion, or even what the right level of segmentation of the grid is, it's virtually impossible to know without it. So then the second way to optimize um, the decision, and the decision really around decommissioning, is largely around when should you start it, like how long should it go, and then what is the right basis for shutting down a particular section of the network if that's the decision. So we've put here some of the optimization criteria are the hydraulic feasibility, the cost benefit criteria, but then usage. And the reason why usage is so important is for a given area, um, the less that is used in that area relative to the cost of maintaining and operating that area, the unit price or the cost of service goes up. And so those areas that use less over time will have the highest cost to serve per unit of consumption. So it's really important to understand that and to factor that into the analysis. And of course, an equity consideration in terms of if certain areas are decommissioned, it's going to force investment in alternative end equipment, and that can have an impact, on different communities. that may not be able to afford it. So we've given two examples that we've worked with ourselves here. One is that there's a decision to shut down portions of the network once you fall below a certain threshold, let's say 10%, because at that point it's really expensive, and that allows a quasi-economic basis for the shutdown. Another way on the right hand is to really decide, maybe for operational reasons that we think we can shut down we can shut down this amount per year. When that starts and when that ends, largely determines the timing and the sequencing of that shutdown approach. Even if you did do a phased approach, you probably should still use the prioritization and this methodology to figure out, if I'm going to do 20% per year or 10% per year, which 10% makes the most sense. So then turning to, how much is this going to cost from a decommissioning perspective, and then how are we going to allocate it, and what could inform this decision making? So the first thing is there is not a lot of data on decommissioning costs, and it's in all kinds of different shapes. So what we've done here is we've summarized in $1 per kilometer. Apologies for North Americans who may not be as comfortable with kilometers, but I'm sure Google can help. What that looks like in terms of estimated costs. And you see there's a huge range here, from 30K per kilometer in Australia to as high as $264,000 per kilometer in one of the studies done in Virginia in the US, and everywhere in between. And I'd expect a lot of that is a function of, well, what is assumed about the assets in ground? Can they be left where they are? Do they need to be dug up, et cetera? And also just how big the system is. In the Evo Energy case, this is the Australian Capital Territory. It's similar to Washington, D.C. It's a small federal area, and so it's relatively compact. So let's talk about cost allocation options. The main ones are doing an accelerated cost recovery, which obtains more funding from current consumers relative to future consumers. There's a recovery as incurred. So over time, as you depreciate assets, you write them down, you incur those decommissioning costs, you collect it over time, and that usually allocates more of the cost recovery to remaining customers. And then there's a taxpayer funded, where you actually don't send a price signal to end consumers about the rising cost of using natural gas, for example. And you can show here on the right-hand side, bottom right, it shows what the actual price looks like in the example that we modeled. And you can see the accelerated cost recovery is a higher price initially, and then about 2036, it becomes lower than the recovery as incurred. And of course, they all go up to almost infinity, because as the natural gas consumption goes down, you've got more folks who then decide to switch away, and you get into the so-called death spiral. Whereas a taxpayer funded goes pretty much to the end, and then goes up. Now, why would it make sense? Let me just see if I'm on the next thing. Yeah. Why would it make sense for taxpayers to carry this cost as opposed to current or future customers? And one of the most surprising things from the work we did here was to identify that death spirals may actually not be in the interest of, certainly they're not in the interest of current consumers, but they may not be in the interest of others as well, because by by having the price rise so much and having people switch away, it will tend to favor those that are best able to do it, for one thing. And also, what it tends to do is it tends to strand the assets in the home. You could be getting a lot more years out of those assets, and it tends to strand the asset that it's already got to be paid for out there in the field. And so, where we landed on this was to advise our clients to look pretty closely at the benefit in terms of leveraging more of the investment that's already made by keeping the price signal out of the consumption price, right? So keep people using gas. Maybe not allow any more appliances to go in there, but allow them to use as much as their existing equipment for the end of the lifetime, and using as much of the natural gas system as possible. Taking into account CO2 emissions and the rest of it, but to get the most of that asset as well, and that tends to be over a long time frame. So I think start early. Maybe not allow any more equipment to go in, but allow those that have made those investments, and also to leverage the most out of the system in the ground. All right. Now, some of the related issues to consider is certainly the impact if you're doing electrification on the electrical system. And here we show from some other work we did the impact of the timing of peak demand in this particular jurisdiction when they went to a clean fuels or RNG and hydrogen, green hydrogen versus electrification versus the TENS. Now, TENS, even though it's using ground source heat pumps, it still has a fair amount of electricity consumption because you got to move all that. That water or whatever your medium is around, right? And so what we see here is that you have a move to February from a summer peak in July to a move into a winter peak, and the timing of that changes by the scenario. And even under clean fuels, by the end of it, it jumps back up. But it's important to understand that this additional consumption can change the timing of peak demand, which has all kinds of implications for resource adequacy, et cetera. But it's something that needs to be factored in. Now, in terms of modifying that impact, there's a whole range of behind the meter resources that can be used here to manage that impact if it drives cost. The other really interesting thing that we found was that by changing the timing of peak demand, it actually changes the correlation with other sorts of initiatives, other transition initiatives like transport. And here you can see that initially the amount of coincidence, i.e., 1 kilowatt of building electrification, only had roughly a 2% or 4% correlation with 1 kilowatt of additional transport electrification. When that peak demand moves to the morning, all of a sudden those load profiles start to correlate much more, and so it can make transport electrification much higher cost within the electricity system, not taking into account what you can do behind the meter. So, some really important to do intersector modeling when you're sort of dealing with gas decarbonization and all the way to transport. Okay, so some of the key takeaways and recommendations. I mean, clearly, as the second largest source of CO2 emissions by fuel type, we have to tackle U.S. natural gas consumption. Electrification is one option. There are other options, and probably the most efficient approach for any jurisdiction is going to be a function of their specific situation, and that a hybrid approach is probably going to give you the least cost option. It's just a portfolio, basically. Um, so electrification, part of the solution is probably going to be electrification, but you're going to have to look at the associated costs, including around gas asset write-downs and decommissioning costs. To optimize that, you really need to look whole of system, and that's not just the gas sector and the electricity sector, but the gas sector, the electricity sector, the transport sector, and of course consumers. And one of the biggest surprises in some of our recent work in the U.S. is just how much people spend on their own appliances, and so understanding the impact of these policies on the consumer, on the builder, folks that buy this end equipment is really important to get the right outcome for the community. So data availability is a major challenge, and so regulators and policymakers and utilities, I'd suggest taking a look as soon as possible about what information you need because it takes time to develop this information. It may involve system changes, it may involve changes to processes, but the sooner you can focus on that, the sooner you can be working with quality data to make accurate, informed decisions. And then key considerations for decommissioning include timing, duration, how you're going to segment the gas system, and the use and level of bans and incentives and cost allocation. So, as I said, significant decommissioning and write down costs, including customer appliances, may favor pushing out these costs and may favor having the taxpayer take on some of these costs. It really depends. So, key recommendations: take a wide view of potential pathways, including TENS and clean fuels. Investigate the cost for these emerging technologies, and highly recommend investing in R&D, a little bit of R&D in these areas. And I know there's a lot of effort on heat pumps, but there's a lot more challenges that R&D is gonna that R&D will be able to help. And I am hoping each of the state jurisdictions is looking at this. More data is essential, and when I said this already, optimizing decarbonization, whole of system is really important, including customer, and that cost allocation. There may be at this stage hidden benefits from not passing through all of these costs when they're incurred to get the most out of these assets and minimize the cost on the community. All right, that pretty much got us there on the nose. Um, If you have any questions, now's the time to be dropping them in the chat, and we look forward to taking questions at least for a few minutes for those of you that can stay. If you have to go, thank you again for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you at our next webinar in the new year. Oh, and please don't forget to complete the poll. I see these starting to come up. Okay, so here we have what the voting options are. Um, the next topic is going to be looking at data centers. Lots of excitement, lots of forecasts that show like 20% year-on-year demand growth. I've been talking to a lot of utilities. Everybody seems to have a ton of applications. Some people have closed new applications. It's if all of this comes to pass, the electricity system is just going to go um, uh, higher than I've ever seen it in my career in electricity, and it will be quite a challenge to meet, particularly as we're trying to electrify buildings, electrify transport at the same time. So thank you for that question, Mike. Have you seen effective incentives for fuel switching that are not through tax deductions and not funded through utility bills? I mean, what comes to mind initially, I guess, is the tech funding, which I believe is an incentive or a rebate. So it's not a tax deduction or a utility bill. And in fact, I'd say that utility bills are relatively infrequent options. I know utilities are working on them, including CCAs, but there's a lot of complexity around managing debt and also, as people move and also how do you provide this to different kinds of folks that may only be renting, etc. Thank you for that question. Is there any other burning questions that have arisen? I know that was a ton of information to process in a very short period of time. I think while we're waiting for those, looks like data sensors is by far the most interesting topic, followed by transport electrification, and then best practice approaches to modeling the impact of climate and weather on demand, which is a topic of increasing interest, I think, from anybody in this space. I think we'll give it a minute or two. Oh, we have another question. Is there a rule of so thank you again, Mike. Is there a rule of thumb for average cost to households to switch from gas to electric? Not that I'm aware of, and it can be it can vary quite considerably, partly because of what the utility may charge to disconnect you. If there's an exit fee, are they going to the different ways to disconnect a house from a like a proper, I guess, soldering of some kind of end cap to stuffing it with some paper to I'm sure other ways as well. That may incur a fee. Converting all of the appliances, I mean, if you do it all at once, that can save you some money on the one hand, but then you may have the appliances that you are no longer using that you could have got more lifetime at. So I've seen lots of different measures, but I think um, if you move, if you install your appliances at end of life and you take advantage of the rebates and incentives that we expect to be flowing through, particularly in California, which I'm most familiar with. Um, the transition incentive or the transition cost to the end consumer, um, I think could almost be, close to incrementally being zero, depending on the level of incentive. I think the biggest challenge are folks that have um, issues with changing out their, changing out their ducting system. Though I understand if you have natural gas, for example, that that was put in probably 8, 10 years ago, and you're going to have to probably reseal it at least to meet California rules anyway. But is there a place where you can situate the heat pump as opposed to an instant service? These are the kinds of questions. And then also, do you have to upgrade your panel, and what can we do about that? All right. Well, I think we'll close it now. Thank you all for everybody who was able to attend. Thank you for your questions. Again, we look forward to seeing you in the new year. Please sign up for our webinar in January. Have a nice day.